Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around I'm talking about spy films. Not your newer spy films, not even this guy. But obscure spy films, and I've had a few thoughts about spy films over the last week or so for no real reason. And I just thought I'd share them with you and point out a few obscure ones and maybe some that you'd like to see. So we'll get started with a few ideas I have about spy films. Number one, spy films are always political. Yes, I know not everybody likes the P word in YouTube videos, but it's impossible to talk about spy films without talking about the politics of spy films. They are always political. They are about threats to the status quo. They're about threats to the order that exists in the world of the movie. And overwhelmingly, though not always, they're about a defender of the status quo. Somebody who wants things to continue as they are, or at least is being paid to want things as they are. So that of course means for the most part they're told often from the viewpoint of the elites, not from the viewpoint of working class people. That's why the Ipcress File, Funeral in Berlin and $1 Billion Brain hit so hard. Harry Palmer was unashamedly a working class spy, whereas all the previous ones for the most part were at least upper middle class, if not aristocratic. And that blew people's mind at the time because, you know, he was a guy in NHS glasses who was saving the world just as well as Eden-educated toffs. Though Harry Palmer was always somewhat cynical about the existing order of his society, and rightly so too. Any working class person that it is just not paying attention. So reviewing a lot of your favourites spy movies through the lens of what's this saying about the order that exists in the world of the spy movie is really interesting. It opens up new vistas and lets you see new things about these spy movies that you might not have previously acknowledged. I'm going from that point to giving you a whole bunch of spy movies that I think are worth checking out. If you want to go back to 1936 at least for Secret Agent, Alfred Hitchcock's movie based on the Ashenden novel by W. Somerset Maugham. This is a really fine spy movie. In it, John Gielgud's character gets recruited to do some work in Germany before World War II and to defeat the bad guys, particularly the Nazis, because of course the Nazis came in 1933. This movie was made in 1936, and so there were concerns about the industrialization, the militarization, and the ambition of Germany at the time. And it's got a great cast. You've got Peter Lorre playing the general, a small, slimy spy. You have John Gielgud playing the hero, Madeleine Carroll playing the heroine, and you get Robert Young, who later turned up in Marcus Welby, MD, playing an American who has, let's just say, not the kind of loyalties most people would want Americans to have in 1936. Good movie, got a great train crash in it. It is that kind of rollicking adventure film, very much like the 39 Steps, which Hitchcock had just made, and another movie called Sabotage, about a saboteur operating in modern London as it was in 1936, which stars Oscar Homolka and Sylvia Sidney. And that has a really bravura scene where the bad guy, played by Oscar Homolka, gives a bomb to a kid to transport across town to where he wants it to explode. The kid gets distracted by the Horse Guard parade in London, and there's a timer in the bomb. And Hitchcock takes us on a bus trip the kid takes. The bus keeps passing clocks. We know what time the bomb's going off. And slowly the tension builds. There are crosscuts between a kid looking around and really curious about the world. And we as the audience know this kid's going to die in not too many minutes because he doesn't know there's a bomb in the package. Fantastic movie. Spy movie still, because the saboteur is an enemy agent. Great evocation of the explosion and the aftermath. It's one of Hitchcock's best bits from the 1930s, and it's a scenario Hitchcock came back to a number of times in North by Northwest, for instance, but also in Notorious. So there's an inbuilt tension in spy movies, and the fear of discovery was one of those plot points that Hitchcock always knew how to apply the thumb screws to. Again in 1942, Hitchcock did it again with Saboteur, with Robert Cummings playing an aircraft factory worker who finds out his factory has been sabotaged and blown up. He gets blamed for it and goes on the run and does a cross-country sprint across America. The character played by Robert Cummings eventually finds out that the enemy is a patrician rich white guy played by Otto Kruger. There's also a great scene with Norman Lloyd on the Statue of Liberty in that one, which is one of the great action climaxes of a Hitchcock film. Again, really good spy stuff. And again, you can look at it through the lens of politics, in that people distrust the working class schlub and automatically assume he's a bad guy, whereas the bad guys are probably at the same cocktail party as the president. And I like that political lens applied to those kind of movies. And Hitchcock, being a working class guy himself, was always very aware of that. There's another one too, which was a prototype of James Bond films, a movie called Q Planes, also known as Clouds Over Europe, from 1939. A whole bunch of aircraft prototypes go missing. A guy called Major Hammond, played by Ralph Richardson, goes after them. There's a test pilot called Tony Vane, played by Laurence Olivier, who's involved, and a female journalist played by Valerie Hobson, who ends up being the love interest in the film. Again, it really is a prototype for a James Bond film. It's got all of the tropes of James Bond films there. And interestingly enough, Valerie Hobson later turned up in a 1960s political scandal because she was married to John Profumo, who was part of the Profumo affair with Mandy Rice Davies. They found out that politicians were sleeping with young women who knew. Q Planes is just delightful fun. It's over the top, it's silly, the dialogue's crisp, the acting is fantastic, and you should check that one out if you haven't already. And then in 1942, you get a crossover with Universal Horror with The Invisible Agent, played by John Hall, who is the grandson of the original Invisible Man, and who finds the formula and goes up against the Nazis, played by Cedric Hardwicke. And also, again, Peter Lorre, playing a Japanese baron, because yellowface was a thing then. It's still an interesting little spy film, quite light. It plays into a cross of genres between Universal Horror and a spy movie, and I think it may be one of the few times where that happened. It's entertaining and it's fun, if you can forgive yourself for watching Peter Lorre, a Hungarian actor, playing a Japanese person. My second point is spy movies show hidden aspects of the times in which they were made. And that's an interesting thing. I was watching Sabotage, the one with the bomb and the bus and the little boy, and a lot of it was shot on the streets of London, and it shows an almost documentary look about what London looked like, what a shop front looked like, what people were wearing, what the cars and the traffic was like. So there are always those aspects of the time in which the movies are made, which people watching in 1936 wouldn't have noticed because that was what was around them. But from a modern viewpoint, you get that extra aspect of it. There are other things I want to say about that, but I'm saving that for some of the juicier bits of point 5 when I make it. Point number 3 is spy movies are about the things mainstream society fears. In the 1930s, it was foreign saboteurs in Sabotage. It was Germany and Japan, though Japan was less of a threat cinematically until after Pearl Harbor. But before that, the first Batman movie serial, I think, had a Japanese bad guy in it, played by J. Carrol Naish. But it's about fears. In fact, the movie from about 20 years ago, The Sum of All Fears, is about the fear of a nuclear weapon being planted in the US. And in fact, one goes off during that movie. So it's about the fears. In the 50s, it was communism. In the 60s, it was partly communism, but it was also about the lengths to which the West would go in order to protect itself from its ideological adversaries. Movies like The Quiller Memorandum and A Dandy in Aspic and The Man Who Came In From the Cold, all of those movies show the lengths to which Western intelligence forces would go to protect what they perceived as a threat. Whether it was a threat or not, or whether it was just part of the big game, that's left up to the audience. And sometimes, particularly in Anthony Mann's A Dandy in Aspic, you can tell that the British intelligence organisations, run by Harry Andrews in this case, were playing the game, and they could have ended the game anytime they like, but they wanted to play it out as far as they could and do as much damage to the opposition while they were doing so. Really interesting film. You should check that one out. I watched it yesterday. Point 4 I'm going to make, which is an interesting one. Spy movies come in two flavours. The ones that support the status quo and the ones that challenge or question it. Now, if you're talking about movies that support the status quo, all of the usual suspects are there. Even the more facile things like the Matt Helm movies supported the status quo. They were essentially about middle-aged, wealthy guys sleeping with beautiful women, hitting bad guys and boozing up, because that was the Rat Pack philosophy. That was the Playboy philosophy of the 1960s. And even though these films were entertaining, all four of them are fantastic. Even though one of them, The Wrecking Crew, the fourth one, had a fight choreographer by the name of Bruce Lee. They're still pretty ropey, but they did support the status quo. There was no questioning of authority. Matt Helm, as portrayed by Dean Martin in these movies, just didn't give a stuff about it. He wanted to just take photos, drink booze, sleep with women. And his boss, played by James Gregory and John Larch, they changed actors midway through the series, convinced him that he's got to go in and save the United States in particular against the bad guys who are not of any particular ideology. They're just generic bad guys. They're not Russia, they're not China. They're just bad guys. Lived up to and including the Mission Impossible series with Tom Cruise. Those movies were very much about supporting the status quo. The Impossible Mission Force, even though it does have an international team, is about protecting America more than anything else. And also protecting Tom Cruise from people being nasty to him. And things like Mission Impossible 3, where Philip Seymour Hoffman jammed a bomb up Tom Cruise's nose, which is one of my favourite parts of that series. It's about protecting the status quo. But there were a number of movies that challenged the status quo as well, particularly as the 60s rolled on and the 70s. The Quiller Memorandum, where Quiller ultimately finds that the girl he is in love with is on the other side of the neo-Nazis, who are the bad guys in that movie. There's that kind of melancholy about it, and there's that questioning of what the hell are we doing and why are we doing it. And then you get a movie from the 1970s like Innocent Bystanders, based on the James Munro novels, where the older agent John Craig, played by Stanley Baker, is training up younger people and is used as a stalking horse for the English intelligence people to grab a man played by Vlad Chabal, who's an agronomist who has developed a way to let crops bloom in the desert. The English intelligence service doesn't need it for any ideological reason. They need it for a diplomatic reason. They're going to sell it to the Arabs for oil. But what they don't know is the agronomist, while he was escaping a Russian prison camp, betrayed a group of his friends. And those friends are now coming after him. So there's a complexity to that one. And the ultimate goal of the intelligence services, who are represented by looms, are really nasty and snake-like intelligence boss, played by Donald Pleasance. They're doing this for political and diplomatic reasons. They're not doing it for any kind of ideology. It's not about that for them. It's about chess pieces and cutting deals. And in a sense, commercialism. Great film. You should watch it. So you get the movies that challenge the status quo, and you get the ones that support the status quo, which are pretty much the James Bond films. It's probably a good thing that James Bond films are on hiatus at the moment, because I'm recording this in June 2024, and I can't really see an ideological impetus for 007 to support Rishi Sunak and his oligarch friends. It's one of those problems that long-running series like the Bond films have, is as ideology shifts and as history continues, it's more difficult to pivot. The James Bond films, the Berlin Wall fell and the Russian Empire fell into the hands of kleptocrats, and so James Bond had to pivot in the early 90s. When 9/11 came along, James Bond had to pivot again. And in the modern era, James Bond films have been more about technological threats to civilization than they have been to ideological or physical threats to the UK. But again, it's going to have to pivot when they reboot the series again in 2026, 27, 28, whatever it is. It's going to have a pivot, and it's going to be about something slightly different, because the world keeps changing. In the 1950s James Bond we got in the original novel is not the same person as we're going to get in the third decade of the 21st century. That's kind of interesting too. Now, the fifth thing about spy movies, and this is where it gets interesting, is everybody was making them. England made them. America made them. Australia didn't, because we weren't making movies in the 60s, and we didn't make spy movies anyway after we rebooted the Australian film industry, because we were too interested in jerking off our colonial past. Might surprise you to know that the Eastern Bloc were making spy movies as well. And I've nailed down one which is really interesting. It's called Starling and Liar from 1974, which was directed by Grigory Alexandrov and starred his wife Lyubov Orlova. and she was a big star in Russian cinema. The movie was made by Mosfilm, and it was about a couple of spies who were lovers, who had been embedded in Western Germany at the end of World War II, and who in the 1970s reactivated to do something for their spy masters. And I'm just reading this part because it's quite complex and I wasn't able to find a copy of the film. The plot of the film also includes Orlova's character Lya getting plastic surgery, and the interesting thing is the actress got plastic surgery too. In this movie, 71-year-old Orlova played a woman in her 20s at some parts of the movie, and she had extensive plastic surgery to play. It doesn't look really great, but it's kind of sort of plausible. And the weird thing is her real-life plastic surgeon Alexandra Shmelev gets a cameo playing the plastic surgeon in the movie. This is kind of almost a lost film because the plot of the movie parallels some real things that occurred in the Cold War, and so it was kind of buried by the Russian authorities somewhat. So everybody was making spy movies. Of course, I've done a video a few years ago about the Euro-spy movement in Europe, and I'll put a link to that at the end of this video. And there were even Shaw Brothers Hong Kong spy movies. There was a thing called Asiapol in 1967, which was a comedy spy spoof. And Japan did the Kokusai Himitsu Keisatsu series, which were International Secret Police series, which was an action movie series of 4 films that were made in the 1960s. And they very much paralleled a lot of the crime dramas and the crime comedies of the 1960s, which Japan did really well, the Yakuza movies. And the interesting thing is the 4th movie in the series was pinched and adapted by Woody Allen to be What's Up, Tiger Lily, where they dubbed in humorous English language dialogue for the movie. That movie is one of these movies in the series, and it's kind of groovy. The original movies are much better than the cut up and yucked at Woody Allen version of it. So spy movies are endlessly fascinating. They're not going anywhere. They may change and shift, and technological innovation and the changes in the politics of the world are going to change the way they're made. And of course, people are always going to make retro spy movies where they make a Cold War movie in 2025, say, talking about how things were in 1967. There are always going to be those kind of jump back, let's do a spy movie, or the David Fincher remake of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. All of that stuff's going to happen because there's a very rich vein of drama and character to be had in doing another John le Carré adaptation. I mean, a lot of the modern ones, the things that Netflix are doing, which could marginally be called spy movies, are more about the action and the spectacle and the one-liners than they are about actually addressing or talking about ideological differences or things that are wrong with the way society works. Nobody is going to make a James Bond film where he goes up against a whole bunch of oligarchs, even though there was that one where Jonathan Pryce played a kind of sort of Rupert Murdoch character. So James Bond films are not going to challenge the status quo. They never have, they never will. But there are going to be spy movies that do in the future, and there may well be small ones, there may well be streaming series. But those ideologies and that ideological staunchness that a lot of spy movies show are kind of a weakness. I like ideas being challenged. I like instinctive assumptions being challenged. And the spy movie is an interesting way that people can do that. And I think we've got some challenges as a planet which are going to lend themselves to be made into really interesting spy movies. So there's just some thoughts I've got about spy movies. Let me know what you think. Let me know whether you agree with me, whether you've seen some of these films, whether you're going to see some of these films. Let me know what other films in that genre you'd really recommend for people. And thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can also leave an emoji if you can't think of a comment, but just let me know what you think about spy movies as a broad genre over many, many decades, and what your favourites are. And just don't say James Bond films, because everybody loves them, except Middle-Aged Cute Girl. Also, if you want to, you can support the channel by becoming a patron at patreon.com/terrydogsmovies. Next up, we got Science Fiction Saturday coming up again. I've got some groovy stuff for that. And until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Who's that guy behind you? And I'll catch you next time.